This video is brought to you by Squarespace.
Let's be clear. Prison works. It ensures that we are protected from murderers, muggers, and rapists.
In the UK right now, our prison system is literally bursting at the seams.
Prisons in England and Wales are full.
Inmates had no access to a shower for 5 days.
Prison which has seen 13 deaths so far this year.
You've got people, 2 men, cramped into a 1-man cell. They're getting so desperate now, people are getting so desperate, they're just beating up their cellmate and kicking the out of people just to get in a single cell.
So today, my friends, we will investigate Britain's prison industrial complex.
A justice system in chaos, prisons dangerously full. And so next week, thousands of prisoners will get out early under new emergency measures to free up space.
It's probably fair to say that here in Britain, we very much look down on criminals as like the dregs of the nation. Bad people who do bad things because they are bad. And it would be this attitude that has shaped the way that we actually deal with criminals. But we have to ask the question, where did this attitude come from? To answer that question, my friends, we must travel back to Victorian Britain, where prisons were pretty unchill. Like, I shit you not, I'm talking you could go to prison from the age of 7, in the same conditions as a fully grown man. Often as part of the punishment, you were forced to just be in silence constantly. Or you would do like hard labor over a pointless task, like you might just crank a gear 1,000 times or something. I mean, imagine that, spending all day doing a completely pointless, monotonous task over and over again for no reason. You could also be subject to solitary confinement for 23 hours of a day. The guards would flog and beat you, and if you were very lucky and well behaved, you might get a bath every few weeks. So of course, disease ran rampant in these prisons. And like, this sounds insane, so you have to really wonder, why did we choose this approach? British attitudes towards crime are fundamentally based in the ideology of Victorian Christianity. The Victorians were incredibly elitist and very individualistic. The ruling Victorian class would look down on poor people, and they would see their poverty as a symptom of their poor decisions. And most importantly to this Victorian attitude, it had absolutely nothing to do with their environment. And you'll notice, like, if you listen to GB News, not a lot has changed.
We have developed a real victim culture where, young men think that society has, done terrible things to them, and that can lead itself to a kind of grievance culture where you think it's okay, society has done this to me, I'm getting my own back.
And so, when it came to crime, the Victorians concluded that the only way to solve this is through punishment. But you gotta bear in mind that these same exact awful prison conditions were not just reserved for murderers, but also mums and their children if they couldn't afford to pay their debt. Yes, being poor was illegal back then. And so this was a bit shitty, right? And even the Victorians started to realise, like, maybe we should change some of this. And so this all led to one revolutionary thinker called Elizabeth Fry. Old Lizzie was of a different religious view, right? She was a Quaker. And Quakers tended to sort of more reject like a religious hierarchy, and they tended to believe more in equality. Elizabeth Fry and the Quakers believed that every single human was equal under God. Now, as much of a fucking wokey that Lizzie was, she wasn't really that bothered about the men committing the crime. She was more focused on the fact that the women and the children were being put in the same prisons as, like, the violent men. So she kind of suggested that maybe we shouldn't do that. She also started to fund some schools in the prisons to try and teach the women a skill. Things like sewing and knitting, to give them a skill that when they come out of prison, they could go and get work. So yeah, Elizabeth's work, although mainly targeted on women and children, was revolutionary and would go on to set the foundations for future prison reform. After World War II, we'd see more and more prison reform. We would ban the practice of hard labor, which was effectively slave labor, where you would just force them to work for free. And we would see more efforts into rehabilitating prisoners. And so it's really important to look at this moment and recognize that this was a distinct and key shift in ideology. It was a moment that moved us away from these very rigid Victorian attitudes of punishment and shame, and moved us toward an approach that was based in data and research. This is important because the way that we were doing it wasn't actually solving crime. It wasn't getting rid of crime. It was just simply punishing it. And so, like, whilst we were locking all these people up and treating them awful, we started to, kind of wonder, like, what is the actual purpose of prison? Is a prison just a place to punish bad boys? Or was the purpose of prisons to make society as a whole safer? And like, it was very good what they achieved, but there was still much more work that needed doing. Politicians were quite aware of this. However, it was pretty low on like the political agenda. And we would see if we look in 1964 at like the Labour manifesto, they back then were speaking of a problem of overcrowded prisons and a failure to truly rehabilitate criminals due to a lack of investment. Doesn't that sound familiar? And the Tory manifesto also talked about a very undetailed plan about crime, launching an all-out attack on the rising wave of crime. Yeah, that one also sounds familiar. You see, ultimately, despite the desperate need for reform, there was a lot of talk, but very little was actually happening. That was until one day.
I'll tell you something, this place will go off, and when this place does go off, the roof will go, man.
"25 years ago, nearly 2,000 inmates broke out of their cells and took over Strangeways prison in Manchester.
Strangeways was Britain's largest prison. It was like an old Victorian building. It was built originally for 900 inmates, but they managed to fit 1,500 by just telling everyone to breathe in a little bit. Terrible sanitation, piss, and poo. There was extreme violence from the prisoners, but not just the prisoners, also the guards were insane. They would literally walk around with National Front symbols on their uniform. And so yeah, the prisoners took over the prison, with one of the prisoners being killed during the riot, along with 147 prison officers and 47 prisoners being injured. This story dominated the headlines, right? This was global news was covering this story. And the prisoners were pretty clever, right? They managed to use all this attention as an opportunity to explain how bad the conditions of the prisons were. And to my absolute bloody shock, the British public kind of supported them.
There's no modern sanitation in the cell blocks, and men, even living 3 in a cell, are required to slop out. If we treat men like animals, we ought not to be surprised that they behave like animals.
The riots led to the Wolf Report, which was an investigation into the conditions of the prisons. And in their investigation, they came to the conclusion that prisons probably shouldn't be overcrowded, probably they should have good sanitation, and we should probably allow prisoners to communicate to their families.
Tell Paul Taylor his mother's here when he comes down! Take care of yourself! I love you!
Anyway, the riots last 25 days, and this would be one of the many things that would lead to Margaret Thatcher resigning in 1990. Her and her government pushed policies of being like tougher and harsher on crime and criminals, but the problem was this approach didn't actually reduce reoffending rates, meaning that it didn't really work to lower crime. It didn't make society safer, it just made them feel good for punishing bad people.
Crime is crime is crime. It is not political, it is crime.
In the 90s, we had found ourselves falling back into the Victorian attitude of punishment, and we had lost track on what was the actual objective of prisons. Before we go any further with this video, I want to give a massive shout out to today's sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is the #1 platform for building and developing your own beautiful website. Whenever I've needed to make a website in the past, I've always used Squarespace. It's really simple, easy to use, and very intuitive. For me, what stands out is just the design, like the templates that they have. With Blueprint AI, you can make your own completely bespoke custom design by just providing it with some basic info about your industry and your company. Combining that with their massive catalog of award-winning templates, you're gonna have a beautiful website. Also, if you're doing email campaigns, email marketing, you can do that all through Squarespace. Squarespace also provides you really detailed analytics into your customers and the people visiting your website. This is just great to get a real clear picture of what it is your customers and potential customers are doing on your website. So be sure to check out squarespace.com/Jimmy the Giant. And to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain, use the code Jimmy the Giant. Anyway, back to the video. The 90s is a really interesting period of time to analyse because although we consider it like the good old days and everyone was just slamming Sunny D's and doing Mizzo grinds on their rollerblades, the reality is that the 90s was the highest period of crime in human history. We just managed to do enough acid and ecstasy to kind of distract ourselves from it.
Everything's gonna be alright, alright, alright.
And so it would be the conditions of the 90s that would create an opportunity for a man by the name of Tony Blair.
Can only get better.
Tony rocks up and he's got a brand new attitude to deal with crime. Tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime.
Is there real policy behind that, or is it just a slogan?
What I believe that you require is to get away from this idea that you choose between either trying to prevent crime and deal with its causes or simply punish the criminal.
New Labour, as it was called, was this approach from Tony Blair and Labour to try and, rebrand the left. You know, they wanted to show that they were the bad boys. They weren't your typical soppy lefty talking about systemic problems, blah, 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 blah. Tony wanted to make it absolutely fucking crystal clear. We also believe that criminals are human scum, but, and just hear me out here, perhaps the fact that they grow up in poverty and we've stripped them of funding and they have very little opportunities makes them more likely to become human scum.
This is just a personal view, but I think that the real problem that we face is that many of our young people are growing up in circumstances where they don't have much of a stake in society, where their environment is characterized, if you like, by family instability, by drugs, poverty, poor educational opportunity, high levels of youth unemployment. And I think it is also important that we try and tackle those causes as well.
Under New Labour, crime rates did drastically drop. From the highs of 18,000 back in 1995, down to 11,000 by 2005 to 6. However, right, whilst this was looking very good on paper, due to Tony Blair's tough on crime, he had started to increase the length of prison sentences. And so, in this same period of time, we were seeing our prison population growing. By 2010, the UK's prison population had reached record levels, increasing by 90% since 1993. So right, that's the whole tough on crime part, right? We're locking them up, giving them a good old hiding. That's great. But what about, the whole rehabilitate, the tough on the causes stuff? Are we still doing that? Well, the best way to look at it is reoffending rates. If you're rehabilitating prisoners, they shouldn't be reoffending. However, in 2010, 67% of prisoners were caught reoffending within 2 years of being released from prison. That is bad. So the question as to whether this was making society safer and benefiting us all, that one's up in the air. However, there was one group of people who were definitely benefiting from all of this. Private prisons. Yep, I know. Honestly, I wish I was joking, but yes, we have for-profit prisons in this country. Originally, before New Labour got into power, they were actually opposed to private prisons that the Conservatives were for. But as soon as they won, they instantly started backtracking on that. Since the opening of the very first private prison in 1992, the UK has the most privatised criminal justice system in all of Europe, with companies like G4S, Serco, Sodexo. In 2019, revenue for G4S was 7.7 billion. Serco in 2020 were bringing in 3.9 million a year. Oh, that's billion. And in 2021, Sodexo's international revenue was 17.3 billion euros. And you might be sat there wondering, you might be thinking to yourself, how does the glorious free market make profit from prisons? There must be so much innovation. They've developed a machine that removes criminality from their brain. No, I mean, what they do is they just charge the government a fee to have a prisoner. That's it. That's how they make money. The government pays them. And so if that's your way of making money, then the only way you make profit and increase revenue is by making the prisons worse. Which if in your brain makes you think, well, that sounds like not a good idea, you would be right. private prisons are 42% more dangerous than public prisons. Staff members in private prisons are more likely to be assaulted. And also, for the prisoners, there is a higher rate of them self-harming, and they have higher drug addiction rates. And I know I'm breaking the first rule of neoliberalism, which is to never question the superiority of the free market.
No.
But, obviously, private prisons create a conflict of interest. If the fundamental objective of them is to make profit and make money, and they do so by worsening the conditions for the prisoners and the guards, when it comes to the idea of rehabilitating criminals, well, how high up the list do you think that one is?
I mean, Serco gets billions of pounds in public revenue for running services badly, and there's been scandal after scandal, and actually the public isn't happy with that. The thing that the government needs to do is to actually look at outsourcing, look at privatisation, and think again about the whole process, and we're calling for more transparency, more accountability, and more of a say for public service users.
So I want to talk a little bit more about crime and to understand crime waves, to give us more context to understand the current problem that prisons are in the UK. If we look at like a historic crime chart, you'll see that after the 50s, crime rates just started to grow. And there is a reason for this, right? So after the war, when all the squad came back and we were all GGing each other because, you know, we beat the Nazis. And like the boys were super buzzing and they hadn't seen their missus in a while, so they all just started shagging.
Oh, behave. Yeah.
Next thing you know, babies are flying left, right and centre. The population is exploding, and this was called the baby boom. So you got to think, right, we had a ton of new babies, so a good amount of those babies are going to be men. And I don't know if anyone's ever told you this, but us men, we can be a little bit cheeky. From the age of 15 to 24, young men are demographically the most likely to commit crime. And so you got this massive explosion in population, and those bros have to go somewhere, right? Next thing you know, you have super overpopulated cities, creating more opportunities for crime to occur. So with this, right, in the 70s and the 80s, Thatcher comes in and deindustrializes lots of Britain. All the while, the banks and London gets very wealthy. So you get major inequality and lots of unemployment. And a little cherry on top is that our cultural values had massively undergone a change through Thatcher. We went from like community orientated to becoming very individualistic under this sort of dog-eat-dog capitalist ideology. And people were becoming more consumerist. So whilst all of this shit is happening, right, America, in their great wisdom, forced the world to just say no to drugs, creating a multi-billion-dollar illegal drug market. And so these young men started to form gangs and they took control of the drug market, leading to the 90s being an extremely high period for crime. However, by the 2000s, crime did start to fall. And so we have to wonder, like, was Blair a genius? Did he solve crime?
I'm just about to speak up, man, now.
Like, certainly Blair was a genius when it came to selling off public assets for pennies to billionaires. But in regards to crime rates, well, you know, there's a bit more to it than that. To give Tony Blair some credit, some of his strategies were successful. Sure Start was aimed at helping underprivileged families, he put more investment into education, and he introduced a minimum wage. All of these things to try and help tackle inequality. But the part that he didn't really have anything to do with was demographics. By the 2000s, people were just having less kids. The baby boom was this one-off explosion in population, and by the 2000s, there were just simply less young men aged 15 to 24 alive to commit crimes. And like, yeah, we also did get better at capturing, recording, and investigating crimes. And as well, the economics of the 2000s, this was a period of like economic prosperity. There was a bit more economic stability and there was less unemployment, and wages were growing with inflation. All of these material factors helping also to reduce crime. But you see, whilst the crime prevention policies were a step in the right direction, really they weren't enough. Because under the surface of this kind of illusion of crime rates dropping, we were very quietly creating another problem, hidden away in the detention rooms of your local public school.
We've discovered that a growing number of children are being excluded from mainstream education for drugs and violence.
Why did you get excluded from your previous school?
Throwing a rock at a teacher.
What kind of drugs were you taking?
Weed, cocaine.
Hands up if you think it's easy to get drugs.
In Britain, we have these facilities called PRUs, pupil referral units, and it's for like naughty or troubled kids in school to sort of give them additional support. Now, it's going to probably shock you to hear this, but PRUs are heavily underfunded. 1/3 of local authorities in England have no spaces in their state-funded alternative provision for at-risk kids. So what exactly happens to those kids?
But PRUs have a bad reputation, a breeding ground for gangs and conveyor belt to prison.
Safer London talks about this recurring story of how when kids are expelled from schools, it can literally be a direct pipeline for them to end up in prison. It talks about how when you have youngsters who, from an early age, were exposed to violence, abuse, loss, and neglect at their homes, these things often manifest in their behaviors. They can either become more aggressive and confrontational, or the opposite. They can become like more withdrawn and more recluse. And very often, these behaviors lead to them getting kicked out of school. It has been shown that 65% of adult male prisoners were expelled from school at least once. It's also been noted that since schools introduced league tables, which ranked schools by their test results, this had created an unintended consequence that head teachers became much more liberal with expelling kids that were a little bit troubled to, stop their test results going down.
In a school of 2,000 children, he had the worst behaviour record.
A student told a teacher I had a knife on me, and they didn't search me or anything. They just said that I had a knife on me, and they just expelled me from there.
And you have to think, what does being expelled from school look like? What do you do, right? You've got nothing to do. You finished playing GTA San Andreas 7 times, so you just walk down the shops. Next thing you know, you're hanging with a group of lads out front of Co-op, throwing Haribos at strangers. Older members of local gangs toddle on over and start recruiting them to sell drugs.
You know you want to hold it, fam. Too dangerous. What do you mean it's dangerous, bro?
And it's a complicated one because, of course, naughty kids can affect other kids in a school, and removing them from the school can help get rid of that nuisance. However, the problem is that when we don't fund alternatives properly, it forces vulnerable children to the margins of society, which is just an absolute pathway towards criminal behavior and then prison. So all of this has left us in a really weird place. While it's true that crime rates are historically at a very low point, we never actually solved the root causes of crime. We were tough on crime, but we were pretty soft on the causes of crime.
We're putting money into every aspect of the criminal justice system. So we're putting more police out on the street, 20,000 more officers out on the street. And when you talk about, stopping people getting onto the conveyor belt, yes, you're right too.
Over an 8-year period, right, the Tory government cut spending on prisons by 22%, dropping from 3.48 billion in 2010 down to 2.71 billion by 2017. On top of doing that, they also cut 20,000 police officers, and they cut preventative youth services by $500 million. All of this due to our favourite friend, austerity. So in this period of time, sort of 2010s onwards, whilst the economic situation of the country was looking pretty bad, despite our overall crime rates coming down, some types of crime are on the rise again, particularly violent crime and theft. These criminals are being squeezed into what is an overcrowded prison, which are currently buckling under pressure and bursting at the seams. At the end of May 2024, we had 80,000 spaces for prisoners. However, we had 87,000 prisoners. And this overcrowding is expected to climb. And when it comes to the UK's reoffending rates, well, yeah, it's not looking good. 75% of ex-inmates reoffend within 9 years, and 39.3% reoffend within 12 months. And I know that all sounds pretty depressing and not very good, but what if, my friends, there was another way? Well, my friends, far, far away from the wastelands of Slough, in the socialist Disneyland called Norway, where free healthcare, childcare, and universities grow on trees, there lies another way. In the 90s, Norway's prison system was one of the worst in Europe. There had tons of violence, there was riots, and they weren't really doing a lot of rehabilitation, resulting in more than 2/3 of prisoners reoffending within 2 years of release. Now, Norway has one of the lowest rates of incarceration in the entire world, and their reoffending rate after 2 years is 20%, and after 5 years is 25%. So, what the fuck happened? How did they do this? Norway looked at it and just used their fucking brains. They realized that punishment is only going to get you so far. But if you actually want to stop crime and solve crime, you need to rehabilitate criminals. And so, in the prisons of Norway, they emphasize humane conditions, as well as giving them education and training so that they can reintegrate into society and be a productive member. Prisoners in Norway have rights. They can vote, they can go to school, they have healthcare. Yes, my American friends, a prisoner in Norway has more rights than you do. If we look at cost, right, in Britain, to keep a prisoner for a year, it cost us $60,000. Whilst Norway's yearly cost is higher, it's $90,000. However, because reoffending rates are so much lower and incarceration rates are much lower, in the long term, it's much cheaper for them. It's been said that in America, if they were to adopt the same system, it would save them $45 billion per year. But of course, when Elon Musk is endlessly talking about governmental waste, you are never going to hear about that. Norway has estimated the cost of them doing this approach for each 25-year-old who's diverted away from doing crime saves Norway $2.4 million per person. And even if that person remains on government welfare for the rest of their life, it will still save them $1.1 million per person. Whilst here in the UK, we spend $18.1 billion every year due to reoffending.
Coming out of prison and having nowhere to stay, yeah. Before you knew it, I had a habit again, Jason. And before you knew it then, I was shoplifting then to fund my habit.
Leon was jailed for a fray in June, released homeless in July, re-jailed for shoplifting in September, and released again 2 weeks ago.
Around 67% of British people that are in prison entered prison unemployed. They didn't have a job. And when it comes to when prisoners are released from prison, we will find that 2/3 of prisoners are still unemployed. Whereas in Norway, prisoners that were unemployed before coming into prison see a 40% increase in employment after release. And just in every single way you could possibly look at it. Like, British prisons are over capacity. We have 107.8% full. Norway's are under capacity. They're just 73% full, meaning they're saving money just there in and of itself. So just to recap about fucking goody two-shoes Norway, their system not only saves them a shitload of money, but it also makes society safer. And Britain's system does neither of those things. And you might be sat there wondering, like, surely the politicians are aware of this data, right? It's quite public data. Why are we not doing exactly the same thing?
Well, the Labour government has implemented a controversial pay rise for prisoners in England and Wales, which marks the first such increase in 8 years. Now, this comes at a time, obviously, when the government and the country is facing significant, what should we say, economic challenges, to say the least.
A man by the name of Anders Breivik, who, despite being a mass-murdering neo-Nazi, he, in prison, has a kitchen, a washing machine, a microwave, even a fully equipped gym.
Now, the prison where Breivik is currently being held, he was transferred to this lavish 2-story complex away from the other inmate 2 years ago. It includes a kitchen, dining room, and a surprising touch, a TV room equipped with an Xbox.
My mate Dave's studio flat doesn't have half of that stuff, and he hasn't murdered anyone. This poses a moral question. Do murderers, do nonces, do rapists, do they deserve all of the same comforts as us if it means they're less likely to reoffend? At the heart of this moral dilemma goes back to that early original question, which is, what is the point of prison? The Norwegian system makes a simple, pragmatic argument. If the data tells us that by treating prisoners humanely, by not brutalizing them, shaming them, and overly punishing them, you reduce the chance of them becoming even more dangerous when they leave prison. But the sticky bit is when you apply that logic to someone like Anders Breivik. He's got a 21-year life sentence, which, if he can prove that he's truly reformed, he will be released from jail at the end of it. The idea of someone as evil as him sitting in a relatively nice, humane environment. On top of it, the cheeky bastard has taken the Norwegian government to court over complaints that he has been mistreated by prison guards and that he wants better living conditions. Understandably, this is going to fill your average person with rage, and it truly pushes the Norwegian approach to its like philosophical limit. However, I think in a country like Norway, where good living conditions are like a universal right to every Norwegian, I think perhaps that this universally high living standard allows people to accept the awful side effect of giving awful criminals a decent quality life. And I think that is at the heart of the problem here in the UK, whereby we don't have that universally high living standard. People have to work incredibly hard in multiple low-paid jobs to afford to live sometimes just on the edge of poverty. And so when someone like that is reading some rage bait article telling them that we spent £21 million on flat screen TVs for prisoners, and not only that, access to education and vocational training, you can fucking understand that there is a completely reasonable feeling that that is unfair. But really, this isn't the problem we're presenting it as. It's a separate problem. The real deep problem here is not about prisons. It's about having failed to ensure the British working class a decent standard of living. It makes it impossible for us as a country to even remotely consider the Nordic model.
She works 16 hours a week, and with benefits, her total income is £1,600 a month. 2/3 of that spent on rent for this studio flat in London. After childcare, she says she's left with around £17 a day.
British politicians are famously like fence sitters. We look at places like Norway and look at all their policies, and we see them working and we go, okay. And then we look at a place like America and their very regressive attitudes and policies that clearly don't work. And we go, let's do both of them at the same time. However, due to the UK prison system being in crisis, due to austerity cuts, it creates a problem where our halfway approach to punishment and rehabilitation, well, it does neither of those things very well.
Be in no doubt, those that have participated in this violence will face the full force of the law. The police will be making arrests, individuals will be held on remand, charges will follow, and convictions will follow.
After the UK riots very recently, it led to 700 people being imprisoned. And so, Keir Starmer looked at the overcrowded prisons and said, all right, let's release half of the prisoners early so we can make room for more prisoners. And, you know, very shockingly, some of those prisoners who were released have already gone on to reoffend. Some of them reoffending to avoid being homeless. But us releasing a prisoner early means they get half of the punishment and half of the rehabilitation. Due to our prisons being understaffed and inadequate facilities, only 35% of prisoners with mental health issues are actually receiving help, whilst just 32% of the people who go through addiction treatment actually ever finish them. So very luckily, our new fence-sitter Prime Minister has come in with his big plan to radically reform prisons. By big plan, I mean small minor tweaks that will basically do nothing and no one is happy.
This mission, Crime and Justice, is my life's work. I've made it central to my Labour Party because it's central to the lives of working people.
So his goal is to open up 14,000 new prisoner spaces by 2031, to give out fewer prison sentences, and to put 13,000 new prison officers onto the streets.
Will that reduce crime? Will that act as a deterrent? I don't think so. It may satisfy our desire for punishment, but whether we want to spend all that money doing that rather than spending it on schools, hospitals, all those other things, that's the political question.
They talk a little bit about what can be done to encourage people away from a life of crime, but they seem to fall short of thinking of ideas of how to actually stop people committing crime in the first place.
I will lead a Labour government that will roll its sleeves up and fix the fundamentals make our streets safer.
It has literally one sentence talking about funding youth services and mental health support, etc. And it mainly just focuses on this tired narrative of reinforcing our strength through policing and punishment. Which, like, sure, you need a strong police force. Like, I'm not against those things. However, if you don't ever tackle the causes, the roots to crime, the living conditions that create the breeding grounds for crime, then all you're doing is trying to make yourself feel good for punishing baddies. Well done, mate, you did it.
We make no distinction. Crime is crime, and this government will tackle it.
As a country, we really need to move beyond this lazy attitude that crime is just this social ill. And understand, because all the fucking data tells us, that crime is linked to the worsening material conditions of ordinary people. As people get poorer and poorer, things are being underfunded, etc., crime is more likely to occur. So we can either double down on like this Victorian punishment attitude, or we could actually follow the data and research to think with our heads instead of just responding with our emotions.
Youth crime is not a problem in itself, it's a manifestation of a series of other problems that we should be focusing on. Social deprivation, disadvantage, poverty, unemployment, unmet needs, health issues, psychological problems that children and young people experience, that adults need to support them with.
If you enjoyed that video, go check out my Patreon. You can come support me. I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.